So as we begin our second session, I'd like to talk about Christ. He's going to be the center, the middle, and in a way the beginning and the end of all that we have to say. And I'd like to turn aside for a moment, at least, from our main focus of wisdom, because what we're talking about is not just a way of knowing, but it's something that happened in history, and that has changed everything and is changing everything. So we need to go and look a bit at that which has happened, and that which continues to happen, and at its living center, at its beating heart, you might say, which is Jesus Christ. There's a text from the first chapter of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, which I love because it puts this so graphically. It talks about the folly of any wisdom which doesn't have this at its core, this at its heart, or any wisdom which is sort of curled up in itself with satisfaction and doesn't need this which has been revealed, which has been done by God in Christ. So make sure we get the center right, so that the center is not a way of thinking, a kind of consciousness. The center is not a way of speaking or of writing, but rather is something that happened in history. And that something is the center of history that changes everything. 1 Corinthians. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. The Jews want miracles, signs from God that will verify that they are his chosen people and so on. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. That's amazing. But that's the word of the cross. That's the mystery of the cross, which somehow baffles our understanding even as it illuminates it. So there's a double shock. There's the shock of Jesus, of this particular human being, who somehow stands above, and better to say it, at the center of everything else. And then the shock of the cross. The shock of after the power of Jesus and his wisdom has appeared rather fully in the New Testament and the Gospels, the shock of his being arrested and tortured and finally killed. The shock of our having to behold, like the first disciples, the death of Jesus in the Gospel. But that's this mystery, this word of the cross, which becomes the center of all, as it expands from its very extinction, from its very destruction. So we speak of this new Christ center as the Paschal mystery, or the event of Christ. Paschal mystery means the death and resurrection of Jesus, specifically. It's a phrase that reappears strongly in Vatican II. The event of Christ is something that I'll try to expand on a little more as we go on. So we can speak of the center as, well, it implies continuity. It's the core of a comprehensive unity. And when we speak of event, however, it means a discontinuity. It means something that breaks in, something that makes a difference, something that changes the shape of everything. We can also talk of Jesus, as we read the New Testament, for instance, in terms of the experience of the people who encountered him. And I think often when we do this, we feel some of their experience ourselves. We participate in that very event of recognition of Jesus. I love those sayings of people who are just, as it were, stunned by what they've encountered in Jesus. Sometimes they have a word for it, the word Lord, for instance. But it seems that the experience always goes beyond the word. And yet we have to remember, after all, the power of the word. Remember when Peter says at the beautiful gate of the temple early in the Acts of the Apostles, there's a paralytic there, sitting there, a crippled man, and he wants a handout from Peter and John. So Peter says, well, silver and gold I don't have, but what I have I give you. In the name of Jesus of Nazareth, rise up and walk. And the guy gets up and walks away. That's the kind of scene that conveys the very power of the event of Christ, as it strikes on a particular individual at a particular point. Here are a few of those reactions to Jesus. There's one when Jesus asked his disciples in Matthew chapter 16, who do people say that I am? And they say, well, some people say John the Baptist risen from the dead. Some people say Elijah the prophet, or one of the other prophets. And he said, yeah, but who do you say that I am? And Peter blurts out, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then you remember he says, well, you are Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church. So that's one of those reactions which it's so powerful that we can feel it as we read it. Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? Remember when there was a storm at sea and the disciples were in the boat and Jesus was with them? And they tell him they're in trouble. I think that's the one in which he was sleeping in the boat. He gets up and he says, be calm, stop. And the sea is quieted and the storm is over with. And they say, who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? What is this new preaching with power? That's when you hear after Jesus, early in his public career, after Jesus has spoken and taught in the synagogue, because he spoke with authority, not like their own scribes. That's the comment of the evangelist. No one has ever spoken like this. That's what you get from the temple police. The Pharisees have sent the temple police to arrest Jesus, and they come back empty-handed. Why didn't you bring him? They say, nobody ever talked like that. Nobody has ever spoken like that. You can feel it, can't you? Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of everlasting life. Those are Peter's words. Again, Peter's always the one that rushes out with a reaction. And so he does in this case. And it's when people start going away, his disciples start deserting Jesus because what he said is too puzzling, too baffling, and too shocking for them. He said, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you can't have life in you. Eat your flesh, drink your blood. So they start going away. And Jesus says to the disciples, are you going to go away too? This is a very poignant moment. Peter says, Lord, to whom shall we go? To whom shall we go? You have the words of everlasting life. And then finally the centurion at the cross, I believe it's in Mark's gospel, after Jesus dies, he said, this man was truly the Son of God. And he's an outsider. He doesn't know anything about the revelation, the history of salvation that the Jews follow, and so on. So those recognition scenes are powerful. And sooner or later, I think we have the same kind of experience, not only as participating in the experience of those people in the gospel, but as our own encounter with Jesus. And it may not be verbal like that at all, but it's the same thing happening once again. I'd like to talk about Jesus as center, and I don't have a text right to the point, but if I find one, I'll pass it on to you. Sooner or later, our own personal experience of Jesus leads us to the realization that he somehow is the center of everything. For instance, first of all, he's the center of humanity. You know, they had that tradition in Judaism in the Old Testament of the expectation of the Messiah, of the king, the son of David, who would come and straighten everything out, okay, and give Israel back its freedom and so on. Well, that Messiah was a center, wasn't he? He was the one, the seed crystal or whatever, around whom the whole nation of Israel would gather and walk into freedom. He was the center because he was the only one out of all the human beings on the earth that could do what he was going to do, and so on. So that's the beginning of that sense of Jesus as center. If you read Paul, and especially those letters to Ephesians and Colossians, again and again and again, you have the feeling that somehow there's one point around which everything gathers, one point which pulls together around itself everything else and puts it in order, as it were, and then gives it life. And that one thing is Jesus. Or to put it in temporal times, in terms of time, that one thing in that one moment is the event of Jesus. The uniqueness of Jesus is the uniqueness of the center. There's only one center. Remember those sayings in John's Gospel where Jesus says, I am. I am the bread of life. I am the beginning and the end. I am the sheepfold. I am the sheep gate, rather. I am the good shepherd. I am the light of the world. There are a bunch of them. And from 7 to 10, I don't remember quite how many. But then there are sayings where Jesus identifies himself saying, I am, which is the sacred name of God in the Old Testament, which could only be uttered at certain times and by certain people. Yahweh. That means I am. Ego eimi in the Greek. And Jesus, when he says that, claims that name as his own. And what he's doing when he does that is shocking, because he's claiming, as it were, that he is one with the one that they have called God from time immemorial. He and God are not two, they're one. There may be two, but they're one before they're two, as it were, okay? that he is divine, that he is the child of God, the Son of God, in a way that nobody else can claim. And yet he brings us into that same filiation, into that same childness, okay, of the children of God. So you can say that recognition of Jesus as the center, as something like a universal center, and the center of our own being, however, comparable to the heart. And a lot of that experience of the centrality of Jesus is a matter not of the head, but of the heart. But of the head too, because it's often with the head that we recognize the center of things, at least partly. That we see that nothing else is on the same level, nothing else has the same uniqueness, the same centrality. We can call that our own Copernican Revolution. You remember that fine day when Copernicus woke up in the morning and said, oh, there's been a little mistake in our calculations. From the beginning of history, people have thought that the sun was revolving around the earth, but it ain't so. The earth is revolving around the sun. The earth is revolving around the sun. We're revolving around the sun. We're revolving around that amazing fiery body. Emily Dickinson said that's the biggest fire I've ever seen or ever found, is that sun that's shining, but nothing supporting it up in, no strings, no cords, no ropes, no pedestals, nothing supporting it up there, hanging up there in the sky, up there in the heavens, and shining 24 hours or more every day. Never exhausted, never tired. That's our Copernican revolution when we discover the centrality of Jesus.